the week. I know people have lots going on. Thank you for making the time. I see people are still connecting and joining.
Lisa, as people, oh, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Now is your time. And if you're here in the morning, I'd love to hear just on chat, or if someone wants to speak, it just one takeaway from this morning, like a phrase or something that stuck with you as a way of welcoming those who are just joining us in.
That's wonderful. So I'm Louisa, and I have the privilege of acting as in the role of facilitator, mediator for this session, as well as Marcus, who will introduce himself in a moment. So this is another session as a part of Win Week, and what Win Week and the Win Network tries to do is to build relationships through creating space for reflection. And this Win Week is committed to renewal. And also to take action together through the many programs and projects and collective work that we do to create a long-term renewal for us to heal through adversity, as well as secure legacies and well-being of generations to come. So I welcome you to the space. Feel free to, in addition to chatting in things that would have stuck with you for the first session, so also chatting your name, pronouns, organization you're connecting from, where you're connecting from, as we get familiar with each other in community and continue to build bonds and relationships. So this morning, we took a look at how we're transforming from within and together, some of the strategic priorities and how we're doing that in community with other people, some of the theory of change and the WIN framework, thinking together about who's striving and suffering and how do we define, thriving, and some of the tools that we use. So thank you so much for those people that presented. This afternoon, we'll be looking at transforming for outcomes, policies, and systems. Let me hand it over to Marquez so he could introduce himself and to share a little bit more.
Thank you, Louisa. Happy to be here again for part two. It was a great conversation in part one. Again, my name is Marquez Frazier, and I'm with the Community Initiatives team. Happy to be here. And just to set context and just to sort of refresh our memories around just sort of our working agreements, just wanted to summarize sort of how we're all invited into the space. And so again, we want to honor our time. So thank you, Louisa, for getting us started at the 2 o'clock hour. And just when possible, please turn on your video camera. Maybe be present. It just helps from a facilitation standpoint to be able to see who you're talking to from time to time. But of course, we understand that you may need to get off and do other things, which is totally fine as well. Always, we invite you all to share airtime. And so if you find yourself in the breakouts or in a larger group, perhaps talking a lot, we want to just create some space for other voices to enter into the conversation. And with that being said, there's always an opportunity to chat out any of ideas or anything that you're holding. And so Shoma, thank you for the example of just adding sort of your name and pronouns to the chat and organization. And so we're just gonna continue to invite folks to do that. Even if you did participate in part one, it might be helpful for folks in part two to be able to see that information as well. And the next two pieces are all about just sort of honoring each other. And so this is a space where we're learning together. So it's totally fine to take risk and lean into the learning opportunities, but also do so with the recognition that we're going to be gentle with each other and practice grace. And above all, always sort of adhere to managing your own needs. And so we understand that we've been on a lot of Zooms lately, and just understanding that there's a cultural shift that's taking place. And so if there's a need for us to maybe grab a drink of water or step away for a second, please know that all of those things are totally fine. And so those are our working agreements. If you have anything to add, please do add those in the chat. But I do want to transition and pivot to Shoma to get us started with our second half of the day.
You're seeing here the We Win Together transformation framework, that we transform from within and together. And we just heard this echoed so beautifully this morning about coming together in relationship, of being known, of knowing each other's stories and recipes, so that you can be in a conversation to talk about real change, so that you can be known to one another. And so today, as we focus on our outcomes policy, our transforming equity and then transforming our culture policy systems, I really invite you to hold that transforming from within and together in mind, and to see this as a loop, that as we work together to transform our outcomes, policies, and systems, we need to continue to learn one another's stories and understand how systems show up and can be discovered in the stories that people have about as they're experiencing the system, and how our experience, our lived experience, can help inform what we're doing in policy and system change. And that as we engage in this work together, if we can do that work in a way that deepens our relationship, that deepens our knowledge of ourselves, we can begin to do this work in a way that truly creates generative, sustaining, scaling change, rather than something that burns out as a single issue thing. As we don't lead single issue lives, we're not going to correct hundreds of years of generational inequity overnight. And so the biggest part of what we need to do is engage in a shared journey in deepening relationships, even as we work to change and renew the core of our social contract with one another and our policy structures and systems. So hold that with you as we go think about, if you go to the next slide. I wanted to, for those of you who are just joining us, we went over the Win theory of change this morning and talked about how we address legacies for living together. We come together in relationship, and that some of these legacies are of dignity and inclusion, others of trauma and exclusion. And that's really the balance of whether we have what we need. All of us need to thrive. These vital conditions of food and housing and transportation. And Richard, I love the way in which you and your community, in the picture behind you, we can see you creating the food that your community needs in order to thrive. That's so many of you are showing what it looks like. Gabby, I see a library behind you in your picture, that access to lifelong learning that we can all begin to have access to. And Louisa, I know you've helped with library projects, mobile library projects throughout rural Guyana. And so I just invite, I know each of you have in your own ways been heroes in helping to assure those vital conditions for everyone. But in reality, if we go to the next slide, we can keep working as hard as we can, as fast as we can, to keep correcting for these inequities down below, or we could come together in shared stewardship, in relationship, to address those underlying legacies and create a path to renewal that not only disrupts and dismantles them, as Michelle said this morning, but that really helps us learn what it means to create new systems that create the conditions for all of us to thrive together, to know one another in a way that we continue to grow together, both as individuals and as a society, because we each have access to one another's gifts, and no one is prevented from being able to participate, prosper, reach their full potential, and contribute to that of others in our evolving nation. And that's, I think, what we're all here to think about today. We're going to focus on some of the strategic priorities. And if you go to the next slide, we looked at what some of those were today, about advancing the springboard and the shared movement for thriving together using the springboard. advancing win measures and an equitable economy, mental health and well-being, and leaning into this moment of COVID to both surface the inequities that were there, avoid new redlining that our generation will create if we can't distribute resources equitably in this current context in the largest public benefit distribution program of our generation. But also to think about how this is a moment of incredible opportunity where the resourcefulness of communities that are closest to the ground, who experience inequities every day, but also resourcefully address and meet one another's needs, can be freed, where the freeing of civic capacity and the unleashing of civic capacity in the local level, not just the ingenuity, the trust that we can have in what communities bring and the enabling systems we can create for their genius to be expressed in the world, can be what leads us out of the situation we're in, of profound loss, into one of profound shared connection and prosperity. Go to the next slide. I wanted to invite us to think about what that looks like. Earlier today, I mapped what those strategies look like across that wind theory of change. You can see we're pretty active in all of these different parts. But today I thought for this session, I'd share some of the resources that you all have been building together and that we've been building in solidarity that addresses some of these things. And I say this because sometimes in each of our cooperatives, we do things, we build things, and we do it in solidarity with many others that you may or may not see here, but they're out there in each one of our cooperatives. But making what we're all working on visible to one another can help us to accelerate change faster. If you go to the next slide. Here are some examples of things that when partners have done. Built Healthy Places Network has created the Healthy Community Investments Policy Scan. There are the trend-bending policies for advancing racial justice that in the context of COVID is something that really grew out of scanning what BIPOC organizations across the country have recommended about opportunities to bend the trend in the context of COVID in the short, medium, and long term. And that's now been translated into a change package of strategies you can take in your community. For an equitable economy, there's an equitable economy policy database. We heard earlier about the Surgeon General's report. I'm going to go through each of these. And then there's some policy briefs around an equitable COVID response. I'm going to briefly show a picture of each of these so that you can get a picture in your mind, and we'll put some links and resources into the chats for you. Go to the next slide. So this is the Build Healthy Places Network policy scan called Healthy Neighborhood Investments. And this takes a look at policies and investments that would work across all of the vital conditions, so that if we're working in this moment to advance equity in the vital conditions, this is a great resource to use, because you can go right to it, say, what might be some policies that I could use in my community? If you go to the next slide. This is the Equitable Economies policy database sourced from both leading organizations, but especially what BIPOC organizations and others have recommended. This a list of 125 policies curated by the Equitable Economies policy team in partnership with BIPOC organizations and other major leaders across the nation, to say what are examples and of policies that we can do that relate, for example, to access and effectiveness of good jobs, to human development, to tax reform, to reparations, to an economic democracy. You know, underneath each one of these are a set of policies. And you know, the work that Amir talked about this morning around the dialogues. Those dialogues are helping to illuminate what policy areas matter most to community residents and count as votes to really elevate the importance of the policies that we'll stand behind, in addition to identifying where there are maybe gaps in our policy map that need to be filled based on their experiences and recommendations. If you go to the next slide, and this sits in the community commons and is accessible to anybody who's trying to say, hey, I get inspired to renew the economy. What can I do about it? For each one of these now, we have an action plan that you can take as an individual or in organizations. Monty spoke earlier about the Surgeon General's report that many members of the WIN network contributed to on community health and economic prosperity, which talks about the role of business in supporting the thriving communities with a focus on the well-being of people, the well-being of places, and those in need, and organized around the vital conditions. If you go to the next slide, we supported that. The Win with Business Cooperative supported that with a series of briefs focused on racial justice, written by PolicyLink, FSG, and Just Capital, belonging and civic muscle, thriving natural world, reliable transportation, humane housing, meaningful work and wealth, lifelong learning. And each of these have practical, specific suggestions of ways businesses can support a particular vital condition in the people that they directly reach, their employees and those in their supply chain, their customers, the places that they're in relationship with, and with a focus on equity and racial justice as a core frame for each of those areas. And how we can begin to use our collective power and privilege to begin to change these underlying systems. Go to the next slide. This is the Equitable COVID response work, initially requested by the COVID task force and now by the CDC and other organizations to support that equity first, a trustworthy implementation mediated by those closest to the ground, with resources going closest to the ground, and supported by those who are working to help support communities to build more people thriving and fewer people struggling and suffering in the context of COVID, with an opportunity to really surface where policy and system changes could come in and help support. And as we do that, as we shift what is currently just let's get money out the door into something that is a more organized, meaningful response that helps meet the need of the whole person and isn't just about getting a shot in an arm, but is about helping to support people to thrive. As we understand what's preventing people to thrive and see that the path to resilience is really investment in civic capacity. If you go to the next slide, we then have the opportunity to lean into some of those longer term paths to renewal, some which have been recommended, as I mentioned earlier, by BIPOC organizations around the country in terms of trend bending policies that include their recommendations from over 100 organizations, along with the integration of the recommendations of the Springboard for Equitable Recovery and Resilience that many of you have put in together. We have a huge shout out to Community Commons for being the repository of so many of these tools and resources that are accessible not just to you, but to everyone. And we've done a huge effort to begin to help make sure that all of these are accessible to the general public, that they are available not just for free, but written at a language level in a way that's accessible and makes sense to the community resident that's working to create change, as well as to the policymaker that's seeking to create change. There's a question from Chris Hollis. The WIN network is far bigger than any organization. There are a few organizations, We in the World, Community Initiatives, Rethink Health, IP3, and others that serve on the core implementation team that steward it together. And then all of you have roles to play as members and partners. And then there's a WIN Stewardship Council that sits and assures that we're all staying on track. So We in the World is just one contributor to the WIN network, though along with the other organizations I mentioned, we hold what we call the trellis, because the real protagonists of this work is not us, it's you. And it's those closest to the ground in communities that we are choosing to stand in solidarity with. Monty, can I pass it over to you?
Sure, thanks, Shoma. Yeah, so hopefully as you are gleaning from Shoma's comments here, there's lots of opportunities to benefit from and join us in exercising our collective civic muscle. And the renewals that we're going to talk about here momentarily really come out of a number of the WIN members contributing and really crowdsourcing what it would look like to meet the challenges of this moment and to do it with a unifying goal of all people and places thriving. So we talked a little bit about that this morning. Next slide, just a quick reminder. Otto Scharmer, who some of you may be familiar with, observes that a lot of times when systems collapse, people rise. We could say that we rise, and that's why I would think we have civic muscle and belonging at the center of this. I think there's widespread agreement that many of our systems are failing, and that there's no doubt that many of these systems were designed intentionally so that not everybody thrives. And when people come together with just cause, we have an opportunity to really transform, our failing systems for the better. And, I think that's really a setup for kind of the conversation we're going to have this afternoon. And the next slide here, there's three kind of pathways that were identified around civic, economic, and social, emotional, and spiritual renewal that seem to really ground a lot of how we either thrive together or not, and are really essential to transform if we have any chance of thriving together, that are certainly connected to the vital conditions. And real briefly, the civic life renewal is really about, and Stacey kind of mentioned this, all the ways that we connect and commit to one another in our communities and society. And it includes local democracy, and whether we vote or not. And we're remembering how important that is right now, as that vote has been threatened in our country. It's how we get together in our neighborhoods for fun and block parties, and how we gather. It's standing up for just causes. It's how we express ourselves through our cultural and our art lives, and how that brings life and meaning. And we're actually going to have Michael Greer from the ArtsFund that's going to touch a little bit around all the different ways that really important component of our lives has an opportunity to renew our civic lives. Economic life is a lot more than just our businesses and our financial institutions, and often those kind of more narrow metrics that are about growth. But it's really about what we value together. And it's the opportunity to renew at this time of collapsing systems. I think a widespread recognition that the economy doesn't work for far too many and hasn't for too long. And by reimagining and renewing our economy, we have opportunities to really, unleash the trapped potential that is trapped in many of our communities because of the type of economy that builds more on adversity rather than well-being. And so we're lucky to have Wendy Ake from the Othering and Belonging Institute that's going to bring a little bit to that conversation with us around what a more inclusive economy, a broader notion of economy that really emphasizes belonging. And then finally, the area around renewing our social, emotional, and spiritual lives are really about how we understand ourselves and how we relate to one another's, and how we really do that in a way that brings purpose and meaning to our lives. And we know that right now we're living in a pretty toxic time culturally, with lots of intergenerational trauma because of unjust legacies. And there's an opportunity to really reimagine what a different cultural life looks like that really starts to support belonging and experiencing purpose. And we're lucky to have Richard Joyner, Reverend Joyner, who lives this world, and I think will bring some really interesting experience around what the possibilities might be there. And so I'm going to turn actually to these three leaders, Michael Greer, as you can see, with ArtsFund, Wendy, again, with Othering and Belonging Institute, and Reverend Joyner with Kanita Family Center. So I think all of you are here, and we kind of had just three informal rounds of kind of conversation, in which after we do that, we're going to pivot into allowing, or not allowing, just inviting all of you into the conversation in some small group breakouts. So let me maybe just to get everybody's voice, and I'm going to just the first kind of round, maybe Michael Greer, you could share a little bit around the ArtsFund, kind of what brought you to that, a little background on yourself and the ArtsFund and what it does and how it connects a little bit to this area of civic renewal.
I'd love to, Monty. Thank you so much. And my background would take probably the rest of the afternoon, so I will be short and sweet on a lot of it. But my name is Michael Greer. I'm the president and CEO at ArtsFund. We are an organization that is based in Seattle, Washington. Our mission is to support communities by supporting the arts through leadership, advocacy, and grant making. I came to this organization in a very strange way. I used to be a ballet dancer many moons ago, and then I went on and did other things. And corporate America, lived overseas working for multinational companies for about 10 years, and then have come back into kind of the nonprofit leadership role. You know, one of the things that I think is really important, one of the things that we talk about a lot at ArtsFund is the connection between arts, culture, and community conversations. And that's hopefully something that I hope we can delve into a little bit more today in this conversation with the rest of my esteemed panelists. But I really think that it is important to understand the vehicles that we have to encourage conversation within our communities. And arts is just one of the ways that we can do that, but we've seen over the past 12, 14 months how powerful of a vehicle that can be for really progressing some of these dialogues. So I think that's all I'll say about that right now. I think it's a quick intro, but we'll get into it more later in the conversation.
That's perfect, Michael. Thank you for modeling that. And just we may actually chat this in. Michael actually also kind of wrote a piece around civic renewal that starts to get at this that you'll hear some parts of. So Wendy, are you there? Maybe you could do the same and just kind of a light kind of background on yourself and all the great work that the Othering and Belonging Institute is doing, and maybe how that touches a little bit on the economic renewal side too.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I wish we could be together in person, but it's good to see faces as much as we can. I direct the Just Public Finance program at the Institute for Othering and Belonging. And within that program, I look at systems around public finance, revenue, expenses, bond issuances, things like that. A part of that work also includes looking at the finance system more generally, and these large kind of macroeconomic systems and financialization as well. The other program I direct, I do two different things at the Institute, is around targeted universalism, which is a policy platform that we help think through in a lot of different contexts. So I have the great privilege of being able to work with lots of different groups and lots of different areas because it's a general framework. So we're able to help folks through who want to think about targeted universalism as a means and a platform through which we can make the idea of belonging really practicable and implementable in the short and long term. When we talk about belonging, I mean, there's a whole conversation we have around belonging, but the primary way we think about belonging is that the primary resource that's distributed around people who belong and withdrawn from people who are seen as other is the idea of political power, resilience, and health. So at the fundamental level, that's what we're thinking about with belonging, is thinking about the primary distribution of resources. Fundamentally, those three are important. The other things I think, I mean, in general, I'm a prisoner of optimism, which is a term that Mark Lamont Hill has used before. So I just recently did a future visioning project with the idea of liberatory education and which factors are uncertain and certain, and I had that big experience, and almost everything I had was like really high uncertainty because it's at a moment where things could be tilting another direction, and I believe in the power of movements and organizing. So a lot of the comments today will be focused around that. My background is in physics and economics, but also in literature and arts. And I was also a dancer at some point. It's good to hear your background, Michael. So, and a movement organizer around international displacement and climate. So I bring that always to the work I'm doing.
That's terrific. Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge to figure out which parts we focus on, but invite you to bring whatever feels right to this conversation as a prisoner of optimism. And speaking of another prisoner of optimism, Reverend Joyner, it's been a little while since I've seen you, but really great to have you join us from North Carolina. Maybe you could just share a little bit about yourself and your organization.
Yes, thank you for today. Thank you, Mike and Elizabeth. Michael, I can't dance at all. My rhythm is not there. And Elizabeth, thank you for sharing. My process has been grew up as a son of a sharecropper, and I'm a retired military person. But my study was into theology, psychology, and religion, and really coming back to as a chaplain at a hospital and director of spiritual care, really looking at how health and was just baffling. And I started out and I ended up in the eastern part of North Carolina, pastoring a small rural church that really, I was administering 30 funerals a year in this small area. And, you know, was trying to grasp the reality of you know, preaching to people and the reality of people suffering and the God present. And I just couldn't get them to fit. And so embarked upon this process of what fresh, affordable food and human development, what would the impact be upon the consciousness and the sustainability of this community with an average income of $13,000 a year per family and no access to grocery stores, very rural. We started out about 15 years ago, and this community, through that process and through belonging and shared involvement, through their youth, build out a 25-acre farm that they own. What you see in the background is produce that they've grown, they're proud of. They feed 500 families a month, and they feed themselves. And they're building economic sustainability through human development and a reality of spirituality through food. You know, and I don't have to yell from the pulpit about spirituality anymore because the farm is very spiritual, very intimate, very healing, and very present. And so that's my process. We serve both the local school system here and the community college and the hospital, and reducing primary health care in the emergency room, reducing 30-day readmits in hospital, and having end of life care with dignity, and creating an educational system from the community that starts in the community, collaborate with the school system. And so this community over these years have gained a sense of belonging in an institution that saw them as disabled people.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for kicking that off. And I think, as you can hear, all three of our panelists are kind of peer leaders here, live at the intersection of a lot of different places, and actually I would say probably thrive at intersections. And so this kind of just next round of questions, if you will, just really want to hear a little bit around where you're seeing in your kind of direct purview either some of the greatest needs and appetite for respective renewal. And again, these renewals are interrelated, so don't feel constrained by the renewal that I've kind of named for you. And maybe where there's a particular bright spot that you're seeing now that you wouldn't mind elevating. So Michael, I'll go back to you to kind of offer up some thoughts.
Fantastic. And Monty, I gotta give it up to you for curating a panel, because my degree is in econ and math, and I am also the father or the son of a sharecropper. And so I don't know if you did all that on purpose, but well done. When you reached out to me and we were talking about what is the need and the appetite for renewal in your area, I will admit I look at these questions predominantly through a lens of arts and culture, and that is a narrow lens, but it is one that I hope we can kind of extrapolate to other other opportunities. But I always like to start conversations like this by reminding everyone, or just reminding myself, most importantly, that the world is probably a better place than it's ever been. There's less, and that's such a hard thing to get our heads around sometimes, but there is significantly less poverty. There are more women and girls educated now than there ever has been. There is, people are living longer, and there's a more middle income, and there's a higher quality of life for the majority of the people on this planet. But I think that, very recently, we've seen in this country, that dialogue does not feel true. And I think the discourse that is present in our everyday lives is actually the exact opposite. And I think this is my personal opinion, but I think that the polarization of our conversations has not only led to like an amplification of that negative feedback loop, but it's also really crowded out a lot of the space to acknowledge the positive things within our communities. And that's a really dangerous thing, in my opinion, is that, we need to have space to acknowledge the positive and to build on that instead of always being reactive to the negative. Now, that has nothing to do with arts and culture, but where does that have something to do with arts and culture? I think that from our perspective at ArtsFund and my personal perspective, arts and culture provide a relatively safe space to have a shared experience with someone that does not think like you. And that experience is also like, it allows dialogue, whether it's through the event itself, or whether it's through kind of after event, or whether it's through digital forums, or whether it's through kind of just a broader community conversation. People talk about the game if you're from a sports community, and you can go to the coffee shop and just talk about that with a stranger. You can talk about the movie, you can talk about the song or the band, or it creates a low pressure environment to have a community conversation with someone that you may not be on a similar plane with. And I think that the conversation can take place in many different ways, but having that low stakes way to engage is just incredibly important, because it gives people a feeling of comfort and familiarity with disagreement, and disagreeing in comfortable ways. And I say it's very difficult to have a difficult conversation around something that is going to directly and significantly impact your well-being, your family's well-being, your spiritual well-being or frame of mind. Like, that is a difficult way to enter into a constructive conversation about something different than you. What arts and culture can do is provide a way to have that conversation that is not so difficult, and to train people to have those conversations. And so I think that is an important way that arts and culture, can engage with civic life. Another way that I think is incredibly important, and I'm sure that others on the panel are going to talk about this a lot more, is the ability for arts and culture to help individuals and communities process trauma. And this is what I wrote about a lot in the article that I wrote for the review. But I think when people are faced with rapid change or severe trauma, you can turn to constructive ways to process it or destructive ways to process it. And we saw both over the past 12 months. COVID isolation was real, continues to be real for a lot of folk. And, that, I don't even know, there's so many terms for it, but I like to say, it is a recognition by white America of a recognition, not a realization, but a recognition of the continued violence and perpetuation of systemic violence against Black and brown bodies. Like, through all of that, the reactions that we saw were both violent and destructive in nature, and also incredibly creative. And when from our perspective, when we looked at the number of murals, the numbers of songs, the number of spoken word that were an attempt to try to process this really just, this huge societal shift, we thought, okay, well, that is the purpose of art. That is a purpose of art and culture. And that's how it can be effective in moving communities through transitions that we're seeing right now. And I'm not, an expert, and I'm sure there are many experts on this call today about, in human behavior, but I do have some experience in art and culture. And I think that the power of the discipline is the ability to express the unexpressible. And, we do that a lot of times with the beauty of it, but you can also do that with the trauma. And I think it creates a healthy and constructive way to process trauma for communities. And the last thing that I'll say, and then I'll move it on to the rest of my panelists, but I think the intentionally or unintentionally, I think the creation and production of art, it reflects who we are as a community, and it reflects ourselves. And like I said, sometimes that is very intentional, sometimes it is unintentional. And it is much easier for us to confront ourselves through art than it is to confront each other. And I think that it holds up a mirror to our communities and a mirror to ourselves that is much easier to engage with than our actual selves or our neighbors. And so again, it provides a one step removed way for us to have these civic dialogues and these civic conversations. And so I think that, the combination of kind of all those three things, whether it be holding the mirror up to ourselves, processing trauma, or really just having the space to have low stakes conversations, I think all of those are ways that arts and culture can help to encourage civic dialogue. And this is just one of many ways, but that's kind of the lane that I'm in. And that's how I see the work that we do.
That's beautiful. Thank you for populating us with a lot of really thoughtful ways of kind of reimagine kind of this important role that arts and culture do just those things, providing space for differences, as you suggested, processing trauma, and really reflecting who we are now. Maybe, as you suggested, all the creative ways that art and culture start to reflect who we intend to be, who we are becoming collectively. And Wendy, I'd love to hear a little bit more. Your Othering and Belonging Institute and has shaped a lot globally, and certainly some of the work that we've done through Thriving Together is connected all the way through, as well as some of your ideas around targeted universalism. What are you seeing as the real appetite and some of the bright spots where folks are starting to really experiment and lean in with kind of reimagining a new economy?
So I was, and thinking about that question particularly, it was great to, again, as Michael mentioned, to think about what the weaknesses are in the analysis and what the structural problems are, but to also think like, okay, this is what's being done about it. Let's focus on that at the same time. So one of the things that I think has been really useful is that there's a greater explicit focus on the need for big government and taking back government. For very good reasons, government has had a bad rap, at the local, state, federal level. It's just failed in so many ways. But in the last decade, there's been a growing, people might not call it big government, but there's a very clear expectation that's being created of people from government and what can be demanded and what they understand as being legitimate benefits they should be getting from government. And I think that's really useful. So like we need a 40-year plan. We're not exactly organized in a formation to counter that, I don't think. I don't think we have the equivalent of an ALEC networked with the Heritage Foundation, Philanthropy Roundtable. There's all the pieces for that, but getting that tight organization so there's a 40-year agenda to get there is something that's starting to emerge. And so that's really powerful critique and sophisticated solution. The second thing is, again, just because of what's already been pointed out, is that there's such extreme political polarization that's tied to corporate power and misalignment of corporate power. And of course the tax system. So creating folding this larger analysis into concrete practices is already happening. There's a growing attention on tax system, not necessarily to pay for other social programs. There's some economics or thinking around tax system doesn't really pay for government services, but tax system so that it can hold back political polarization and inequalities. Like a tax system is important to function in those ways. So if we have a better system that can underpin and undo some of that inequality in wealth, inequality in corporate power, then we can really start making, jumping and leaping forward in what our progress is. And so those are two things I think about. Within corporate power, being very specific about what we mean by that. One of the fields I work in can really kind of be collapsed down into financialization, and how, a lot of folks understand like neoliberalism having been a massive economic change, a massive change in the role of government. But even towards the end of that, in the last decade or so, there's an extreme role of how, one aspect of that is that the household has become a means for profit for financial corporations. 2008 was an artifact of that. Mortgages were, for the first time, become an avenue for massive profit from this finance system. Student loans are being taken up. Home equity loans have been taken up into the finance system. So there's a unique focus under financialization that the household is even a scale of profit for the system. And so it's kind of like the way in which finance system captures imagination and thinking about what solutions can be, and starting to really undermine and get around that is something the movements are doing right now. So even as shaping the way we're thinking is something that the corporate system has been able to infect, and seeing some of these really beautiful things that are undermining that. So, local food systems that Richard mentioned might not seem to be like a massive, working at this macro level of economics, but they are. They're totally working at the household level and community level for food. That's a macroeconomic change. So being able to understand how these things are scaling up and fitting together is something I find very hopeful. So we have financialization, corporate misalignment. It's a huge piece of that. And then also trade agreements, international trade agreements. So those are the three areas I really focus on. So that I'm not, within trade agreements, we're not necessarily anti-globalization, but it's a massive corporate misalignment about how that's occurred, how that's rolled out, what the international relationships are between nations, how those function. With COVID, that's coming up. We have these intellectual property rights that are being held up and depriving countries from vaccines. So these three pieces that are sometimes understood to be strictly economics, and in the purview of these very narrow definitions that economists put on that, all of these things are economics. It's a political economy that really needs to be captured in thinking about economic change and economic prospects. Yeah, I think my comments can wrap there, and I'll pass it on to hear more from Richard. I'm looking forward to what Richard has to say about this as well.
That sounds great. We'll hand it over to Richard, and I see Shoma just kind of adding on to your comments that really also reflect global racism and inequities, and the financialization of everything, as you suggest, has not captured our imagination, has really limited our imagination of what's possible and why the economy exists in the first place. And Richard, just kick it over to you to take it wherever you like. I do know that you kind of work in the intersections, not only food, but intergenerational trauma, and how you connect that piece of it. And you talk about human development a lot around what are these multi-solving opportunities, and really starting to break the chain of trauma into stronger spiritual, emotional well-being.
Well, thank you so much. And as my partners have said, this whole concept around, globalization of stuff, but then narrowing it back down to a small perspective on community sustainability, community human development. And it's not a 1,000-acre farmer anymore, but it's about how do local foods impact the holistic health of the people that participate in it. The beautiful piece of how the arts really take shape of a food cart, where students have their pictures painted of their food and themselves. A 5-year-old person holding an eggplant that he or she literally grew themselves, or students who were wanting strawberries one year and couldn't afford it, that is now harvesting enough of strawberries to not only sell but share with everyone. Is it's a local fulfillment. Last March, the pandemic coming around, and a community that would normally have to stand in line for food boxes was the one that were giving out food boxes from their own farm, uh, uh, which is huge, because it gives reality to education, it gives reality to long health. And, growing up sharecropping, I really didn't see the need for me working on the farm because I never could enjoy the economics of the farm. And so I think now with really looking at it, the health component of it, where we see that people in these places are having longer life. They're feeling better about themselves. They're feeling better about each other. And we have experienced that. We have a Martinez Lopez, who is a Latina person from Mexico, Miss Catalina from Guatemala, and all of everybody around here sharing at this level. And it's an intimate level, but it's a sustainable level. And so I think that for us in this eastern part of North Carolina, which most of our farm labor is still being ran by slave labor called H2 workers, who are working 100 hours a week, making $7 and $8 an hour. And so, which is aging twice the stage. But to see this process moving and imagining food and imagining farming and imagining healthcare and sustainability from a whole nother perspective. I think as we continue to look at that, and then changing policy with the new food bill coming out, how the whole piece is changing because of local Black farmers and farmers of colors are now at the table.
Beautiful. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, just a really elegant reminder of, as we scale back down and bring things into community, how, again, multi-solving, seeing the work that you're doing accrue so many benefits across all types of human endeavors. I just wanted one more quick round with each of you and then start to invite some others into it. So still pretty broad. Each of you kind of indicated that there is an element of where you sit that it really brings your perspective of hope. So I'm wondering where you all are seeing, particularly as we look a little bit further into the future, something that you're excited about that you'd like to see scaled more, something that we should be thinking about that's not currently on our radar screen as we think about all people and places thriving. Just a couple of minutes. Where do you all go as you start to think about the future and what you would like us to kind of be left with? And Michael, I'll loop back to you if you don't mind.
No problem. First, I want to give a shout out to Reverend Joyner. Just a little bit of background. I spent some time working for a microcredit firm in northwestern India, and there's a lot to be said about microcredit from our economic colleagues here, but the benefits to communities of small scale economic endeavors is just something that I've seen firsthand in communities of extreme poverty, and it's miraculous to see how it changes far more than just, what you're putting in your mouth or what you're putting in your body. It changes your entire community. So I want to say thank you for that and acknowledging that. As far as hope, specifically to the lane that I operate in within arts and culture, I'm encouraged by the tables that I have been invited to sit at in terms of reimagination, revitalization, and where our communities are moving. I am currently on in work groups or task force for downtown Seattle revitalization, for national conversations around downtown and community-based the revitalizations, reimagination, and they are not art-based, but I think that what I'm finding and getting excited about is this idea that there are more individuals outside of arts and culture that are acknowledging the role that arts and culture can play in revitalization. And that's not just within civic dialogue, particularly within the economic sphere as well. And that's a whole nother thing that I will defer to Wendy on as our expert. But I speak a lot in my circles about the economic benefit of, I call them maybe not non-traditional sectors, but sectors like arts and culture, gig workers, and the arts and culture community as a part of revitalizing downtown and our main streets and in our rural communities. I mean, Washington is a big state. Yes, we live in Seattle, but there's a lot of other areas in the state of Washington, and having conversations with a lot of elected officials out there who have invited me out to their districts to say, hey, our main street, our theater, our train museum, a lot of that is integral to how this community sees itself, both economically and culturally. And how can ArtsFund help encourage that, both in Seattle and just a perspective of like, what is art and culture in the community and how can it help drive positive change. So I think that in terms of what I have hope in is that I would like for the conversations about civic reimagination and dialogue and all to include the arts, and to include a different component. And like I said, I have a pretty hardcore background in economics and math, and like that needs to be a component of it as well. But I think that if we can meld a couple different lenses for looking at how to reimagine our communities, and not flip, one way or the other to the extremes. But if we can bring all these conversations together, then we're going to have a more robust conversation, more robust solutions that will be less affected to these crazy shocks that, we've seen, whether it's housing or whether it's COVID. There will be more middle ground. So it'll be less impactful when we do have these crazy things that are going on in our community. So I'm encouraged by just bringing more ideas and more conversations to the table around civic re-engagement and community reimagination.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. And again, I encourage folks to check out just even the ArtsFund's website and work, because there's some extraordinary examples of all the things that you've kind of touched on. And you all are really a pace setter, not just for Washington, but for the country. So, Wendy, how about you, as you think of the future and hope, and any specific examples you'd like to lift up?
I'll lift up the examples of the co-panelists, because they're really beautiful examples of what we're talking about here. And some of the recent convenings we've had around tech-induced unemployment, or the future of AI, and the way that those currently are shaping up to be really powerful tools of marginalization. But again, there's like a development around how those might be better channeled for changes that we need to see. We aren't able to educate our way around that. Like, there's a lot of discussions around retooling skills and retraining, but there's people who've pointed out, like, this is a problem where if we're going to look at the sphere of education, we need to look at like liberatory education. We need to look at, as Michael just said, educating for people to be able to be more empathetic, to be prepared for the fact there's a massive change that's happening in the US and globally due to demographic changes, climate change coming. And so that's really the focus of what we can think about within the realm of education. So again, like it's another area where something that's treated as an economic problem is really deeply social and deeply interpersonal. And so we have these, strawberries and eggplants and art projects very much a part of that change agenda. The other, again, like a point where there's a lot of contestation and effort and organizing going on is if we have that anxiety that's produced and really is well organized for neo-fascistic tendencies and January 6th events at the White House, it can go two very different ways. But we do see like really good things, like Florida enfranchisement of returning citizens was the largest enfranchisement since white women, followed later by Black women, got the right to vote. So these signals of greater inclusion of who's belonging are really important. And again, like there's fantastic pushback against all of those things. So we're in a moment where if again, great potential for change, great potential for threat. So with any kind of moment of crisis, a threat and opportunity for that. And related to that, of course, is like, strictly speaking, economic policy coming out of COVID. So there's just a massive amount of funding. In 2008, it's estimated that there was $29 trillion that went out of the Fed. So completely separate from looking at bills that come out of Congress, looking at what the Fed is pouring in. So this time around, the Fed is trying similar strategies, just throwing in money for liquidity directly from Fed, not in Congress, again, to distract attention. But that's not the economic problem right now at the macro level. It's not a problem of liquidity. In 2008, it was. The people were out of money to transfer from bank to bank. But now it's a problem of solvency. So we have to be looking in a very different direction. And that has to do with household debt. It has to do with state debt, municipal debts. That has got to be the focus. And we're so far from that at the policy level right now. There's, again, the Fed is doing the same script, throwing money into the markets for liquidity, and that's just completely misdirecting. There's a lot of really great work. INET and Institute for New Economic Thinking has been having a lot of economists and scholars who've come on and starting to talk about, let's assume the case for that has already been made. Let's talk about how we can implement this. Like, let's get going. And so they're talking about refinancing credit card debts, refinancing home equity lines of credit as a way to like really get around this crisis and come out of that. The work that's much more familiar and to folks around student debt, it's not just about providing relief to students, whether the students obtained a four-year degree or didn't, or debates about how many different students are struggling in different ways, but it's also an economic expansive policy overall. So it's something that will stimulate the economy. And again, it's because there's a shifting focus around whether we're doing policy around a completely misguided diagnosis of the problem. So even in economic terms, it's not the right thing to be thinking of right now. But if we're able to make that shift, it's really useful for having people feel like they're included if they're not being exploited by debts.
Yep. Wendy, don't want to cut you off. Was that your?
Yeah, I had set my own. I had set my stopwatch, except I didn't realize it would be audible.
Right. I'll just say I'm so grateful that there's minds like yours that are part of a lot of important conversations around where our economic policies and our experiments might go. And I think is maybe to send it over to Reverend Joyner. I think, as you point out, there's this moment of crisis offers up enormous opportunities, but we should not be naive to the fact that there are some real headwinds. There's some real resistance to renewal in maintaining the status quo of inequities. And so, Reverend Joyner, where do we grab hope?
Well, it's very hopeful to be on with Wendy and Michael. And to reimagine farm with arts, the arts on farm, and to reimagine farming from not an economic embarrassment, but economic hopeful process. And I think that, we have bees, and to see kids imitating bees, how bees fly and how bees fly in patterns, and to talk about butterflies is the arts, and for adults to really see that there is an economic gain in this process, even from healthy eating and relationships that reduce stress and anxiety and deal with chronic disease, from systemic racism. And to be able to have someone like Miss Bunch, we call her, she's 82 years old. And when she look at the plight of H2 workers on the farm, she fight for immigration, she fight for rights to drive a license. But she too remember when there was a time that she couldn't leave the farm. And it's amazing that that's hopeful, and to see that there's healing in this anger, and even myself, after everything I've done to end up back on the farm, it says that there is something to this greater than I have ever imagined. So I'm with Mike and Wendy. I think the collaboration of the three of us and all of us will bring the greatness of all of us out. And none of us will incarcerate no one for our pleasures, but we will work together for each other's sustainabilities. And where on this farm, we got Baha'i faith working, we got Muslim working together, and we got people from India that come and work together with us. And it's not a religious problem in the conservative Bible belt line of the eastern part of North Carolina. Now, if that's not a miracle, food has been powerful. And that's my hope.
Yeah. I'd say that constitutes a miracle. And and I appreciate your sense of hope, and just appreciating all of the panelists here. For a moment, we were kind of debating, we were going to maybe go into small groups, but I'm seeing some comments in the thing, maybe just wondering if we might stick for a little bit in a larger group for a moment to see if there are other things that are jumping out for folks, if there's other things you'd like to hear any of the panelists kind of go a little bit deeper on, instead of kind of going to the small groups as I'm looking at for cues for folks. So one of the things I was just real quickly curious about, Wendy, you talk about target universalism. I think there's a collection in it, is how target universalism actually starts to shape the way we think about the economy a little bit. I wonder if you could just take a quick minute around how that way of thinking might change the way we think about what constitutes a good economy.
Yeah, thank you. So when we talk about targeted universalism, because it's used in so many different contexts, it looks very different depending on how it's used. But some of the important parts, I think, is that so you think about a universal goal in which many people have an investment in realizing. So people come to the table oftentimes to work on policy because there's such gross inequality, there's such gross disparity in how people are suffering, and other people who are so much more well off and better situated. So when we talk about a universal goal, we're thinking about responding to those gross inequities, but then framing it in a way where a much more diverse group of people has something to gain from reaching that goal. So what a simple example sometimes that we use is around Portland and housing. Every different group was below the national average for home ownership. So policy was constructed around raising home ownership rates to the national average. So it ended up having a smaller bump for white groups and a much larger bump for groups who are worse off in housing. So Latino groups, and Black African American groups as well. So that's kind of the way in which we think about you having an offer to demonstrate the way in which belonging can be expressed, a concern for many different groups of people. But in thinking about this conversation where we're so thinking about what we're hopeful for, turning to something that Reverend Joyner mentioned around this tradition of what's happening from the South. So the South is the largest geographic area. The fastest growing regional area is diverse communities with more than 40% people of color in suburban areas and regional areas, a greater attention to diversity in rural areas. So in thinking about how to design policy around that, it's not just paying attention to different groups of people, but thinking strategically about where there's different needs depending on population. And Southern organizing traditions is a great source of hope for this work. And again, also a lesson for how progressive movements during Reconstruction were just met with Jim Crow to wipe that out. So it's instructive in the way that this is such massive, urgent attention we need to give right now to economic change, understood as political economic change. And yeah, so I'll just throw out the movement organizing that's happening in the South now and throughout history is really inspiring and a really important place to look in the country because of demographic change that's happened there, has existed there historically, and that's going to be across the country, and the danger of what if policy doesn't invest in communities that are, going to be the majority of population in the country and are also projected to have zero or negative wealth in the next 40 years, 30 years. So the massive importance of directing policy is something that targeted universalism also looks at because it's targeting particular groups of people.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know if, Richard, you want to say anything about Southern movement organizing? And that is, if you'd care to, and I just want to invite others into anything that you're hearing that you'd like to chat or actually just pull yourself off the microphone and speak into from any of the panelists.
Well, if Michael and Wendy can move to North Carolina, I would be appreciative. We need both of them in the eastern part of North Carolina. This whole policy shift, and North Carolina was one of the top 10 growingest states is in the union, and we're really beginning to look at this whole piece around policies, and so it is a real unique concern for us as we look at, are we growing in the right direction, and will people here be forced out of the process while the growth take place? And so we're trying to really be hugely involved and participate in the policies that govern this growth that we're in. The economic piece is huge because we have a chance with this administration to really be at the table with policies and looking forward into the next 2 years, that we don't sleep the next 2-year process that come up and get pushed backwards into some place. So it's a huge concern of ours. Is this is the type of process that we're really trying to stay on top of. And we do have a lot of generational suffering at the same time. And so Wendy is right on top of it, Michael, and thank you guys for sharing, because it brings so much healing and reality to how we release this chronic generational suffering of internalized racism, and how do we share with our Latino brothers and sisters that is headed down the same road, and can we make some changes that give all of us access to economic development and sustainability, and at the same time. And we have not experienced that, so we're trying to create something. We got a hold of it, now we're trying to create something that we have not experienced.
Great. Super helpful, and also super helpful to see all the links that Wendy, you're dropping at the same time. And again, we're just do a light touch and some small breakouts here now. But Michael, any kind of last piece from you?
I'm not going to follow a preacher. So I know better than that, but I will say thank you to both the Reverend and Wendy for being a part of this. You know, I stay in the lane of arts and culture, but this conversation is so much bigger, and I'm really just, you know, I'm humbled to be a part of the conversation. So thank you.
And Michael, thanks for reminding us that these lanes are a lot of times artificial, and that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of us being able to really move into these renewals of seeing the connections, and you all shared those beautifully. And I think we're just going to take a short period of time in small breakouts to, again, give you a chance to say, where are you seeing the real opportunities for renewals in your respective communities and your respective work, as well as any other things. Shoma shared a lot of ideas for and kind of things that are in motion for the WIN network. What are some of those opportunities for the WIN network that you'd like to lean into, or where you'd like to see the WIN network continue to maybe consider some new opportunities? So particularly hone in on that, where are opportunities for renewal that you're working on or embarking on in your respective network or community? So we're going to go into breakouts for about 15 minutes or so, and then pull back out and hear a little bit of your thoughts on that front.
All right, everyone, I'm opening up the breakout rooms for 15 minutes, starting now.
I have to leave. I'm late for a 12:30, but don't care because I had a great conversation. But thank you all. This was really, really just great. I love everything that you guys are doing. So please continue to involve me whenever you can.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it. It's honored to have you. You mean so much when you're in our spaces, and we'll definitely follow up with you. And I think maybe even follow up with some of the other resources that you've shared in the past that, I mean, just really thinking about some of the transformative work that you do and your team does that we haven't had a chance to touch on.
Love to do so. And I think that the South is like Georgia. It holds a very transitional process for the liberation and sustainability. I think that if we win the South, I think we will win it all.
I see a lot of heads shaking, if you can see them from your office,
All right.
from your greenhouse office.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care, my friend. Let's see here. We have a few. I know we just have a little bit to wrap up. I know some of you have been on with us the whole time, which we really appreciate. I didn't know, was Shoma still here? Or did Shoma have to run? If not, would love to just, again, take a minute or two to hear what was bubbling up that you would like to lift up from your conversation. Where was there some energy and possibilities that came out of your small group discussion? Would love to, anybody who could kind of speak into that would be welcome.
We were also discussing a little bit in our group about how underutilized the South is, especially the Georgia runoff race really proved how much it's just underutilized. And I was saying how a lot of times in progressive spaces, sometimes it gets pushed to the side because we just assume they're always going to vote one way. So yeah, it is. I really feel like it's an underutilized resource.
So Gabby, real quickly, as you speak into that, what could you imagine, leaning into that? What does it mean to kind of fully maximize some of the Southern assets and possibilities?
I think really galvanizing people to go out and vote. I feel like a lot of people are frustrated with the systems that affect their lives, but don't really know the next step to take. What community organization they can take part of, stuff like that. Just getting the resources and getting those events out and that information out to the people.
Okay. Thank you, and great to have you part of the team. See a couple of comments here. Finding commonalities between urban and rural communities and thinking. See that from Elizabeth. Was there somebody in your group that could speak to that, Elizabeth, or yourself?
Oh, sure. I was lucky enough to be paired with Michael Greer, so we continued the conversation about the power of arts to create safe spaces and connection, and we focused a little bit on youth, and then realized that part of Michael's work and part of the work that we're doing at Community Initiatives is thinking about how do we connect with rural youth and youth who are really experiencing mental health challenges and wanting to offer support and connection. And that led us into realizing that it's not helpful to think in terms of this urban-rural divide, but to really recognize this continuum and all of these connections along the way. So it was a really interesting discussion and continued some of the themes we talked about in the main room.
Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm curious, Louisa, too, just even with the Youth of Solutions and kind of where you see possibilities, at the WIN network and others of kind of bringing together this youth from these very different experiences, and one that's kind of a false divide sometimes. If you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
Actually, I don't mind. I was actually thinking about sharing a little bit. In our group, we actually spoke a lot about networks and connection, and figuring out what matters to people, because even in from community to community, from household to household, there's so many things that affect people differently. And one of the things that we're talking about in our group is, how do we want to be more inclusive, or do we want to go deeper? Like, where's the balance between trying to do everything per se, or versus, really getting deep into, what we do and leveraging our networks and things like that. So that was a really interesting conversation. Thank you guys for that. In terms of youth, one of the things that I do think is, I try not to think about youth as kind of being in an exclusive bubble, but really thinking about how, they could be brought to other conversations and other spaces, and to help to develop their leadership in all spaces, because the youth of today are the adults of tomorrow. And I usually find it in my work, when I talk to youth, or when in my mind, I'm like, okay, the youth is this age group, and adults are beyond this age group, but very often there's a big gray area. A lot of youth are taking up more and more professional spaces. They're certainly in transition, and there's the people who've been at it for way longer, and there are the people who are now coming in. Even sometimes the language that we use is different. Another thing we spoke about is how do we bridge that gap between people who are coming in with the enthusiasm and the new ideas, and the people who've been there a while and have kind of done so many things, have tried the advocacy, they've tried the education, they've tried all these things. How do you balance that nurturing accompaniment with the experience of older people. But certainly, I think that those genuine relationships help. And I think youth do bring that spirit of renewal and new energy to those people who've been working, I don't want to say for decades, but for a long time, and passionately working in the fields that they are, and sometimes feel a little bit of burnout. So yeah, I'll stop there.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I see again a number of heads shaking as you're speaking. Have a minute for a couple of other comments if you'd like, and things that are jumping out as you hear Louisa or out of your small groups.
Monty, I know Wendy and I had the opportunity to connect and so appreciated that extra time. And one of the things that she was lifting up is how, or sort of the number of, cities and towns across the country who have been reaching out, and as they kind of reimagine on a path to renewal, sort of this moving from diversity and equity toward belonging. And given that we've got our friend Paula Morgan on the line here with us this afternoon, if she might forgive me for inviting her to share a bit about the work they've been advancing.
Yeah. Hi, Stacy. How are you?
Good.
I think that is for the Fox Cities area where I live, that is the real opportunity for us in our community. And in a small group discussion I had earlier, we shared a little bit about how you actually hear a couple of years ago, we worked with Monty and Stacy to develop, gather a community to co-create a vision for the Fox Cities and what we want that to be, and for generations to come. And one of the key opportunities for us was the sense of belonging, and meaning, for people of color, for various ages, for sexual orientation, diversity, but, really, for others also moving into the Fox Cities area that don't know us feel like they belong. And so it's really interesting now that we set this vision. One particular group that's really stepped up is a group called Common Ground, which is a group of faith leaders that we helped organize about 15 years ago, who said they want to be part of the secular work that happens in our community to build community and kind of put their theological differences aside. And so that group is really taking a huge lead in dialogues like Graham was talking about earlier today, pairing small group work across political divide, across racial divide, across religious divide, and fostering dialogue and communication across our community, and doing workshops to train people how to have those conversations. So we've got about 150 people trained in that regard. But also, we've been doing some series through the Imagine Fox Cities visioning work on race and policing, on anti-racism in the community that have been really well received. And so the timing is really right here, and the community's poised to be very engaged in this work. Mm-hmm. And we're on the cusp of doing our second well-being survey. So we'll sometime this fall hopefully be hosting some kind of a gathering again of our community to talk about all of this work again, re-bolster it, renew it, and see what the real impact on well-being has been, particularly over the past year.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paula, and for your leadership. If you had told me, and this 2.5 years ago, that the group sitting around the table would be having the conversations that they're having around policeism, racism, anti-racism, around belonging, I honestly would have been not just your community, but I think a lot of communities that were leading those types of efforts, I would have found it hard to believe. And so I find it incredibly encouraging that there's this honest conversation. I think it has a lot to do with the relationships that undergird what you all created to create those spaces, but kind of back to this morning.
Richard didn't talk about it earlier today, but his effort began with Southern Baptist congregation and a Muslim congregation coming together to set aside their religious differences. So imagine that in this tiny little town in Canada, North Carolina, you know, what that took to be able to get that to happen and to help people set aside what they were doing to really support human development, as he would say. And it reminds me that in the south of Texas in this moment, there's a bilingual learning collaborative that's happening. And by that, I mean, it's truly includes a language justice component and of a reclamation of culture and language as part of equity, not just direct translation, but the power dynamics of how language is enacted in that space. So that's a real investment in civic capacity with faith communities as a major part of that, redefining and acknowledging their own history of racism and colonialism and how that played out, not just within the faith community, but also in the south of Texas, the legacies that they had and inherited, and what that meant for indigenous people, for Mexican people, for others in the area, and what it meant, how those legacies are showing up today in their data, and what that means to make the restoration of culture, the restoration of an honoring of language, the restoration of dignity and belonging alongside the restoration of resources to interrupt that cycle of and sort of the shift in the master narrative that needs to accompany a shift in their strategy from charity to equity to liberation. And I think in it just makes me think, if that's possible in the south of Texas, it's possible in Wisconsin, and it's possible in North Carolina. Like, this is possible.
Yeah. I love that, Shama. Yeah, and I think right now, as we've been talking about polarization, and some might suggest the politicalization and radicalization in some ways of our faith community right now in America, in a lot of different ways, that the faith community on the other side of this could really, in ways that, again, we were hearing this morning and today, and bringing together different faiths is a really important space for us to think about renewal. And again, just to double click on what Louisa was saying, I think that we're already seeing the real possibilities. If we're talking about renewal, if we're talking about the future, you know, we need the next generation leaders to kind of be in the lead of that. And I think are, again, offering some moral clarity and new ways of thinking about that. Thank goodness. So I know we're about ready to, we're running kind of out of time, but it's been an amazing conversation. I think the WIN network is well poised to continue to just be one of the networks to either get behind other efforts or to host other areas, as Shoma kind of pointed out, to kind of support, you know, well-being and equity from an intergenerational point of view. And Shoma, as I'm watching you getting ready to take a next bite, I don't know if there are any other reflections you want to make, just to kind of connecting the dots from where you started and where we are, and Louisa as well.
You know, I think I have nothing new or brilliant to say, only appreciation to each and every one of you for being someone who's willing to be in relationship and to put our pieces together. When I look at who's around the room, from Brittany leading efforts with Healthy Cities and Counties at APHA and so many others, to Wendy with Othering and Belonging, to Roxanne and the work she does, and Paula. I mean, we truly have people here who, and Louisa all the way from Guyana, and Raymond, who's just joining and trying to figure out what is going on. With Christian, you know, what if anything, I'd love to cede some floor to Christian to hear his voice and to hear what he, as a youth who's been listening all day, has to say and what he's been thinking about. But the biggest thing that I can say about any of this is we have to be all in, and we have to recognize that we have to get ourselves ready to learn to be in solidarity, because most of us have a fair amount of privilege. If we're here with the capacity to be here, we have some privilege. And then the question becomes how we use that privilege to both educate ourselves and stand in solidarity together. I don't mean we don't have experience places where we have inequities too, but I'd love to lean into our gifts that we have to offer one another. And one of the biggest of that is how we offer our stories, our relationships, and our shared collective thinking together. Christiane?
Can you hear me all right?
I can.
Yeah.
So to focus on renewal in COVID-19, communities of color have been, negatively impacted, especially during COVID-19. And I think it's important, to focus on mental health, people who suffer from, mental health, who have depression, who suffer from substance abuse. It has worsened from COVID-19. And I'll also bring this up a little bit tomorrow during tomorrow's session. But the police brutality that has been occurring, it's also had a great impact on people's mental health. So I feel as if we need to focus on how to improve the mental health of people of color, because seeing all of these events on the news, on the television, it really affects us. So to focus a little bit on what we talked about today, art can positively affect people who suffer from substance abuse, people who suffer from mental disorders. You could use that as a way of healing. And also food. I don't know if I've ever brought this up before, but I don't want to be one of those vegans that always say, "Oh, I'm a vegan," but I'm a vegan, and I understand that the food that we eat, it can also heal us. When I became a vegan, I started to do better in school. It was a lot easier for me to learn. It was a lot easier for me to focus. So, I really appreciate the work that the Reverend is doing, giving these natural foods, these vegetables and fruits to communities that can't always, afford it. This can really affect their lives in many ways.
Thank you so much. So glad that you're with us. I always appreciate your reflections, Christiane, and your leadership. Louisa, do you want to take us home?
Absolutely. As I said before, it's been really amazing to be in conversation with you guys. And I guess just thinking about, what else we're doing in the network, we wanted to just take a minute to note that we've been thinking a lot about how do we continue to support the network, especially those that have joined us for the racial justice community over the summer. And we have a couple of options here. I'm just looking at the time. So we're thinking, we really want to get your opinion on just what would people be interested in and what it makes sense to offer at what level. So we're going to have a poll in just a few seconds, but there are about 5 things we're thinking about. We're thinking about a shared immersive experience, and like in terms of having a unique virtual bright spot experience for teams or individuals to highlight innovative work to inspire your team to act. So that's one. Another one might be a 2-day virtual action lab, something a little bit more intense, where we can join others in dedicated time to reflect and strategize. Another one might be an action phase where people set their own goals for the summer and use rapid cycle testing to reach their aims. Another one might be peer action groups, where you join others working in the same field of work and meet regularly to learn from and with each other. Another one might be drop-in coaching, where we have scheduled time for individuals or groups to join as needed to discuss resources and source solutions. So if you have any questions on these, please let us know. I think now would be a good time to put the poll up, Fanny. So we really appreciate
as many as you're interested in, right, Louisa? Because they can be combined.
Absolutely. So I'll just give you a minute to do this. So while we wait for the responses to come in, we really appreciate you sharing your thoughts to help us plan what would be most useful to support the community as we go forward, especially when we think about racial justice. And also as a reminder that we're at day 4, but we have one more day tomorrow, which is the final day of Win Week. There'll be the Win with Business session on economic renewal, as well as the Global Youth Dialogue. And if you need more information or you have not registered yet, there is the link. You can check us on Eventbrite. So we got some info on the poll, so we see a lot of people responding that they'd be interested in a shared immersive experience and action groups, as well as some of the others. So if you have any thoughts or questions, Seth is our person. I believe you can email. Do we want to put your email there for people to reach out to you, Seth, for questions, or if you have any additional ideas? Or you can just reach out to any of the other people that are part of the core team, and I'm sure they can put you on to someone else. And again, finally, thank you so much for joining us. And we really appreciated the time that you took to be in community with us.
Thanks for guiding us, Louisa and others. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. We interns, we're going to take a 15-minute break before meeting.